All right. It is time to talk Kropotkin. We are on Chapter 3, Anarchist Communism, which Kropotkin opens with this quote, "Every society which has abolished private property will be forced, we maintain, to organize itself on the lines of communistic anarchy," end of quotation. Womp womp. Unless he would see the Soviet Union as anarchistic, which it was not. But to be fair, at least here Kropotkin is honest enough about the criteria, namely abolition of private property, to kind of like say this is the criterion as opposed to, well, it didn't work, so it's not real communism, right? He's not like the modern communists who, fall back on that idiotic, pathetic state capitalism excuse, right? Because the Soviet Union did abolish private property, so, man, I guess not. Further quote, "Anarchy leads to communism, and communism to anarchy, both alike being expressions of the predominant tendency in modern societies, the pursuit of equality," end of quotation. None of the modern society tendencies are toward equality, at least not in his time. They are toward impoverished equality of the masses, combined with the existence of an unaccountable parasite class, which is not equal in quality or quantity of consumption, nor in political power. In short, Kropotkin is engaging in fantasy. Next, he equates medieval villages with communes, which is confusing and foolish. He's confusing serf poverty for equality and ignoring the existence of feudal lords, who were by no means equal to the serfs that they were overseeing. He starts calling roads and stuff like that in common, as if there weren't specific groups of people who claimed ownership of those land improvements, and therefore laid claims to at least parts of their commercial yields. There's a fun article touching on liberty concepts in times of feudalism. It's by Joanne Cavallo, and it's called "Feudalism and Cronyism in Machiavelli's Italy." I'll put a link in the description. Quote, "If the looms for weaving or the dyes for coloring fabrics were improved, all profited. So even in those days, a peasant family could not live alone." End of quotation. Those improvements were not manna from heaven. And the improvements of looms in one place did not magically improve looms elsewhere. There were small groups of people who claimed effective ownership of those looms and were responsible for improving them, while other loom owners did not, or did so at a slower rate, which is also something that happens that communist theory often ignores, that capital improvements happen in layers. Not being able to live alone is the condition of the division of labor. That's a capitalist thing. It is the effect of it is not the but an effect of having capital goods. It doesn't imply communal ownership of those capital goods, right? The reason that you invest in capital goods is to increase your production in one particular area, right? If you're living of subsistence by yourself, then you have to make everything that you need. It's much harder to build up capital goods in such a case. But if there's a division of labor, which is a function of voluntary exchange, then you can say, oh well, I'm particularly good at weaving cloth, so I'll invest in a loom. It's easier to invest in a loom than it is to invest in a loom and a shoemaker's thing and chickens and cows. If you're living alone, right, then you need to invest in everything, and so naturally things get more dispersed. It's the fact that you have a division of labor that encourages you to pick a lane, basically, and then to invest, whatever savings you have more productively in capital in that particular lane. Okay, the next thing Kropotkin does is he repeats his over-aggregationist nonsense about how, since the understanding of these technologies was not done by any single individual, therefore no one has any personal claim to property in any of these individual pieces of capital goods. He's not made a good argument for this. This is a mere rhetorical flourish and not an argument. It's based on a deliberately fogged vision of how things work, right? When you aggregate all capital and say, there's no one that owns all of this, nope, and therefore nobody owns any of it, that's just a logical fallacy. It is true that every single piece of capital goods has a chain of homesteading, a chain of ownership. These people pulled minerals out of the ground. These people, they handed those minerals to other people in exchange for something. Those people refined those minerals into metals. Then they handed those metals to someone else in exchange for something, and this chain of ownership exists, generally speaking. And, pretending that it doesn't because there's not like some general ownership of everything that somebody has is just nonsense. Now, Kropotkin gets into a little bit of very weird non-standard terminology. So he calls those arguing for hourly wage payments collectivists, quote, with a capital C, and then connects his collectivism with individualism or mitigated individualism, where his individualism is capitalized also. But he doesn't capitalize the individualism in mitigated individualism. Figure that one out. Anyway, he argues that hourly wage payments make no sense if society, quote, considers the instruments of labor as a common inheritance, end of quotation. He's basically putting the cart before the horse. Certainly, if all individual owners of capital have been expropriated and liquidated, right, and those capital goods have been forced into communal ownership, then, one can envision labor remuneration not taking into account the discounted marginal value product of labor, at least for a little while, right? If you're unfamiliar with the discounted marginal value product, it's basically another way to break down the labor expropriation argument of communist nonsense. Rothbard does a really good breakdown of the concept in Man, Economy, and State. Link in description. The problem, though, of ignoring the discounted marginal value product is that if those discounts that are inherent in some specific use of the capital goods aren't accounted for, then there's not going to be enough materials left over, time to do labor, whatever, left to maintain and replace those capital goods as they break, as they get used up. Kropotkin is unwittingly, or maybe wittingly, signing a death warrant for all capital goods by sweeping the costs of using and maintaining them under the rug, right? Let me give like a 3-second explanation of discounted marginal value product. The wage laborer, generally speaking, is doing something that he could do by himself if he had the tools to do it. But what he's basically doing is there's a capitalist who owns some capital goods. And those capital goods, maybe it's a loom or maybe it's a cotton gin or something. This laborer is using the capital goods temporarily to make product. And instead of taking ownership of that product, he takes a certain amount of cash immediately from the capitalist, right? There are some advantages for this. For instance, if it turns out that the cotton that he's harvesting with the cotton gin, suddenly the market for cotton goes under, right? That laborer still gets his payment. If they're used to it taking 6 days for the cotton to be sold, and suddenly some of it stays on the inventory shelves for 6 weeks, the laborer gets paid now. The capitalist has to wait those 6 weeks in order to get paid. There's a lot of reasons why someone with low or rather high time preference would go for a labor job rather than take the role of a capitalist. And that's kind of how voluntary exchange works. The people who have the highest time preference go into positions in the economy where they get paid with the least delay, right? And with the most marketable goods, usually money. Capitalists, on the other hand, get paid in things that don't have immediate marketability, whether they be stock options or capital goods or, payment of loans over long periods of time. This is a concept where we hear this over and over again, that the laborer cannot buy the things that he's making. It's like, well, yeah, he's renting tools and he's getting paid now, not when the stuff goes to retail. It's a trade-off, and all of economics is about trade-offs. But continuing along this line, if you had a society that was based on the elimination of all private property, yeah, you can't have wages or exchanges because there aren't any actual transfers of wealth that can be maintained. That would be private property. It would lead to inequality, and so there'd need to be a constant, you worked an extra hour today, you got this extra thing, you got to make sure you don't save that. You got to use it up right now on something else, because if you save it, then you're going to start, using it to exploit your fellow man, which, aside from the logical nonsensicalness of that, of voluntary exchanges being exploitation, it's an incentive system that leads to the destruction of all capital goods eventually. Even if you believe that hammering down all these material differences between people is desirable, this method seems to result in widespread consumption of existing capital goods, followed by paralysis as shortages appear, followed by basically extinction. And this can happen surprisingly quick. I keep bringing up the Holodomor because it's a really good example of this. So the next thing Kropotkin talks about is that individuals, capital I, individual societies, quote, are inevitably impelled in the direction of communism, end of quotation, and italicized in the original for some reason. He talks about the, quote, tyranny of capital and of the state, end quote, and he mentions an individual being unable to get what he wants even with money. He argues that modern tendencies are to mix old-style village partial communism with, quote, the communist principle in the 1,000 developments of modern life. He goes on to repeat his kind of misguided judgments of the 10th through 12th century guild systems, attributing their productivity with communal behavior as opposed to the reduction in expropriation and the proliferation of more private property rights, the enhancement of private property, that actually made them more productive. He's basically looking at a complex thing, picking out one thing, and saying that's what made the things better, when all of the evidence points in the other direction. He attributes large commercial efforts with the township, and makes some very iffy statements about who was in charge of commerce in those days. Hint, it wasn't the township. It was individuals using their privately owned property to make profitable exchanges. The township often provided an umbrella, right? It would give other township groups, like, hey, these goods came from here, but they weren't in charge of the production or the movement of goods in any meaningful sense. They would often skim off the top a little bit, but that's how all states work. Kropotkin goes on to note, quote, the folk piously cherish the memory of them in their legends. By them, he means these old guilds. But people frequently don't understand economics, and especially protectionism's downsides. This doesn't prove anything. The fact that people piously cherish something doesn't mean that it's true. They're basically cherishing the memory of things that happened before their births even, right? So they're cherishing history that was written by the victors. You're going to get a distorted view of things if you choose to, what to cherish based on that. Kropotkin then confuses the appearance of organizations dedicated to the fuzzy ideal of, quote, to every man according to his needs, end quote, with the feasibility of such a thing through abolition of private property. He then confuses the existence of certain pricing structures as suggesting the supplies of certain goods or services are now unlimited. For example, season passes on train systems, free libraries, schools, etc., public parks, that kind of stuff. There are a lot of problems here. First, many of these things are funded by state expropriation of private product. That's problem number one. While it may be possible, right, to skim 5% of productivity off the top of production and have the producer still have enough to kind of make a profit and keep producing, it's not so if you expropriate 100% of their productivity. There's railroads in particular, there's a great example of this. Rothbard has a fairly good analysis of railroad subsidization in the U.S. in his book, The Progressive Era, link in description. Second, the existence of certain pricing structures doesn't mean that those structures could survive attempts at 100% utilization, right? If the purchasers of these train season passes all tried to ride the train simultaneously, the resource would have to be rationed, and you'd quickly run out of room on the trains. Okay, we're back. A little weird interruption there. Sorry about that. Okay, so I was talking about Kropotkin looking at price structures and being like, well, there's a season pass for this train, and like that means it's not scarce anymore. And I covered 2 points already. First, most of these things are funded by state expropriation for the first point. And second, the fact that these pricing structures exist doesn't mean that they're designed to deal with 100% utilization. Now we'll move on to point 3. Often those season pass price structures are there to make use of things that are already happening, like the trains running on schedule, which is what they're supposed to do. It doesn't follow from that there's an infinite number of train seats, right? They would eventually have to stop selling those season pass train tickets if utilization wasn't 100%, they'd eventually run out of seats. Fourth, We've seen the differences in productivity between privately owned and publicly funded train systems in America. That Rothbard article should talk about that, but Rothbard does talk about it somewhere. I might have the right article or not. We'll see. Easy to find anyway. But basically what happened when there was a mix of privately and publicly funded railroads in America is that the privately funded ones were solvent, and the publicly funded ones went bankrupt. The incentives strike again. So, the next thing Kropotkin goes on about is he goes on to connect, erroneously, the existence of public-funded services as evidence that scarcity has been conquered in those areas. There's an interesting thing about his statement about public laboratories or workshops in St. Petersburg. I could not find any significant historical evidence that these were common. They may have existed for a short period of time in this particular city. As far as I can tell, they didn't exist anywhere else. But like hypothetically, there were these places where, like, if you wanted to invent something, you could go and they'd, loan you tools for you to do measurements or study something. And it's like, well, okay, first off, number one, the state probably prepared those and paid for them. Number two, they weren't open to everyone. Like, they would have gotten mobbed by, homeless people otherwise. You probably had to have some kind of qualifications to get into them, even if they existed. And number three, they didn't exist for very long. Number four, I couldn't find any evidence that they produced anything of note. And, it's just not a very good example for historical. It's like one historical cherry-picked thing that has never been reproduced anywhere else, and breaks a bunch of basic economic, incentive structures. The users of these things, if they existed, must have been sufficiently identified and tracked to minimize just the theft of these expensive instruments, stuff like that. It's kind of silly. And then it gets sillier, because Kropotkin goes on to equate the cooperation of men on a lifeboat with modern society in general. He's confusing the willingness of men to work together under dire circumstances and with the willingness to give up what they've earned in non-life-threatening situations to those who refuse to contribute, right? Like, in a lifeboat, it's kind of everybody's going to make it, or maybe nobody's going to make it. If the thing capsizes, we're all kind of screwed. It's short in period. There aren't any real capital goods per se. There's maybe some preserved foods to ration out, in which case you already have a method for handing it around. There's not really any labor to do per se, right? It's just making sure that the boat doesn't capsize and maybe trying to collect some dew, in the morning or something like that. This is very different from a perpetual situation of a non-life-threatening, conditions where there's just some people who refuse to contribute at all. He confuses the ability of occasional, short-duration charity efforts with the existence of some kind of infinite capacity for charity, and he's even ignoring the need. Sometimes situations require triage. Some things just can't be saved. And he's kind of ignoring this too. And yet he goes on. Because finally we reach his actual argument, which I'll summarize as thus. When capital goods are, quote, placed at the service of all, end quote, when business is conducted on communist principles, i.e., quote, to each according to his needs, unquote, etc., when labor recovers its place of honor in society, Kropotkin expects the sphere of voluntary charity will expand to become, quote, the ruling principle of social life. When capital goods are placed at the service of all, they wither, due to the tragedy of the commons. When business is conducted on communist principles, the definitions of needs stretches, both upwardly and downwardly, to fit whatever purpose some commissar desires at any given time. There's no reward for innovation. Central planning gropes in the dark, as formerly plentiful resources become scarce again. As for labor recovering its place of honor, it's not labor that's the problem, it's the need for types of labor that have high disutility. The best solution to minimize labor disutility is the building of more capital goods and the payment of compensating differentials to those in those jobs. But Kropotkin belittles the role of capital and encourages systems that disincentivize building more and disincentivizes the changes in wages to people who are doing crappier jobs. As for charity, expanding to become a ruling principle, Voluntary charity can only expand so far as actual surpluses exist. Without private property, there can't be any voluntary charity because no one owns anything to give to anybody else. Living at subsistence means that there really aren't that many goods to be spent on the unproductive. Lack of property rights means there's no incentive to produce. The two together are a fatal combination. Then Kropotkin declares that anarchist communism is, quote, the synthesis of the two ideals pursued by humanity throughout the ages, economic and political liberty, unquote. It's worth repeating that there can't be any economic liberty without property. One cannot exchange freely to satisfy one's wants without property to exchange. As far as political liberty goes, no real-world attempt at implementing anything like communism has done so without resorting to a large tyrannical state. The fact that all goods, from the most ephemeral consumption good to the longest-lasting capital good, must have those who are authorized to consume or use those goods at any given time, requires some kind of agreement as to who that user or consumer is. In the absence of private property, that authorization necessarily falls to what Kropotkin might call the community, right? But realistically, it would be paralyzing to have a general vote anytime anybody tried to use anything. The authorization would fall to a limited group which would exercise effective ownership over all of these goods. Whatever form and rules this organization adopts, it cannot avoid the totalitarian nature of the task at hand. And the negative incentives of the existence of this group would inevitably lead to absolute corruption. They would basically get rid of their, perceived enemies and, provide, what little benefits they could to their perceived friends until they become enemies. And then they'd airbrush them out of photographs. Kropotkin goes on to argue that the, quote, marked tendency of human progress, end quote, is toward shaking off, quote, the yoke of authority, unquote, and moving to a system based on individual liberty. He points at modern developments that seek to limit the extent and power of governments and hand more freedom to individuals. Ironically, we find that this trend, which had been moving forward in tiny intermittent steps for around 1,000 years, would be completely arrested by attempts to institute socialism and communism. The Marxists weren't content to simply run a few countries. They have nurtured and propagandized a significant fraction of the public, even in relatively free societies, to believe in the rightness of the government enslaving people and taking their property to waste on fruitless attempts at central planning. In the pursuit of impossible ideals, whose attempted implementation invariably creates some of the worst, most destructive incentives imaginable, and, results to boot. Or to match. It's worth remembering that even Marxist communism argues that eventually the state will wither away. However, history shows repeatedly that socialists, once they achieve political power, usually consolidate that power, destroy human liberty, and turn themselves into a new elite. The withering away of the state is a phantom, an ideal intended to convince the gullible to hand power over to an aspiring socialist elite. Kropotkin then declares, I don't say argue, I say declares, that the need for the state is a conditioned response in the same way that the need for private capital is. This is a false equivalence. Logical arguments point these two propositions in different directions. One can point to the fact that most of an average person's private interactions with other people doesn't involve the state, or don't involve the state. One can make arguments that state involvement is Pareto inferior to voluntary transactions. There are plenty of purely logical arguments against central planning, against totalitarianism. On the other hand, logical arguments about capital show the opposite. The creation of capital goods requires labor without consuming the immediate results thereof. The disutility of labor means that, absent some kind of reward, production of capital goods will be severely diminished. Setting aside the fact that generally people are more concerned with their own welfare and of those closer to them compared to the welfare of those whom they don't know and might never meet, I observe that the rationale of faraway benefits also provides a great way for the central planning body to obscure whether excess labor has made any benefit at all. To underline that a little bit, if you're in a commune and the commune, the authorities of the commune are saying, well, we need to help this commune out that's across the world, they can hide an awful lot of corruption and an awful lot of graft in the fact that they're sending goods over there, because you will never know whether those goods got there, had an effect, were used appropriately, that kind of stuff. really what it is it gives people an opportunity to say, well, that is to say you love your family more than you love the commune. So I'm going to take your things and bring it to another commune. But it's just a smokescreen, because what it really is you love your family and you don't want to give all of your things to me. Well, I will take your things and I will keep them for myself and tell you that you did good when there's no actual good being done except to line my own pockets. In short, even if a person did care about helping faraway people as much as himself and his loved ones, which is something that history shows is not true, the long-range disconnection between labor and benefit provides a method for corrupt planners to skim the benefits to themselves without actually moving those extra goods to those faraway people. It's a trick, basically. Kropotkin then mentions how, quote, Balzac already remarked how millions of peasants spend the whole of their lives without knowing anything about the state, save the heavy taxes they are compelled to pay, end quote. Talk about self-contradictory. They know nothing about the state except that it must be paid or they will be punished. Kropotkin makes some arguments about merchants needing good reputations for people to buy their goods and how this encourages them to keep their word, establish mutual confidence, etc. Of course, these all depend on private ownership. When property is laundered through some nebulous society, right, it becomes much more difficult to fix blame by design. If instead goods have a clear chain of ownership, it becomes much easier to trace torts back to the source. It's worth noting that Kropotkin is committing this new Soviet man fallacy. He argues that by no longer basing society on the appropriation of the fruits of others' labor, which, by the way, he hasn't proven this is the case in laissez-faire, he's arguing that by doing so, mankind will be much more moral and honorable. This is an escape hatch, because what it basically does is it gives him a way out. If man didn't become more moral, then it goes on to show that the appropriation didn't truly stop, and therefore it wasn't real communism. You know how I said that, at least he doesn't mince words about the abolition of private property being the criterion for communism, like the pathetic state capitalist people do? Yeah, he does it here. Kropotkin goes on to criticize, quote, representative government, capitalized, end quote, by noting that parliaments seem inclined to regulate, quote, all our spheres of activity, as if communist authoritarian, commissars wouldn't. The problem here is the same problem that plagues all governments not operating on a purely voluntary basis. As soon as you give somebody or some group, right, some different set of moral rules, or the ability to judge their own actions and say, oh no, we investigated ourselves and we discovered nothing was wrong, they will inevitably seek to use these exceptions to expand their power. Or what they'll do is eventually they will attract the power hungry into their ranks, and then they will expand their powers. That's even worse, right? At least with the initial case, you might get 50% good people and 50% corrupt people, but then the next generation, 100% corrupt. The ideal of representative government is also a limited government. And it's important to note this, right? Because yeah, there are tons of flaws with representative government, but part of the reason why philosophers like Locke and Sidney and so on kind of came up with the idea of representative government as an agent, right? Government as a servant, is because they were fighting against, divine right of kings assholes at that point. Part of what they said is that the government can only do certain things, namely what the people could do before they constitute a government. However, it's natural to seek advantages in things that you've agreed to. Even if you sign a contract with someone, you're going to be like, well, I can interpret this a little bit nicer in my case. Maybe we can see if that goes through or not. This is true of even like real contracts, let alone social contracts. Alternative moral rules and or self-judgment encourage governors, whatever form they take, to increase their powers over the governed. Once you say, hey, yeah, you can kill people, and everybody will think it's okay as long as you say these magic words, right? You can enslave people, but everyone will think it's okay as long as you say draft, right? Once you give that kind of power to somebody, anybody, sooner or later, what will happen is that they'll say, well, if I can enslave people to go and die in a foreign war, or in a defensive war, right? If I can enslave people to go and die in a defensive war, maybe I can enslave people to go and die in an offensive war. And maybe I can enslave people to go and die making things for my luxury, right? You're eventually going to end up in that sorry state. the principle of limited, but in these cases, it's important to remember that the principle of limited government is violated. Even if you agreed to some kind of contract that said, yes, in the case of a large-scale attack from a foreign country, I pledge to help with defensive combat, right? The person who takes that and expands it to be, oh yeah, you also pledge yourself to offensive combat in foreign nations when we invade somebody else. That's breaking the contract. That's violating the principle, the ideal at least, of limited government. This is not, as Kropotkin pretends, this is not an argument against limited government. It's an argument to limit government even more. And Kropotkin's not really giving us a clear reason to believe that anything that he's proposing would result in limited government. Quite the opposite. Kropotkin notes that various semi-voluntary organizations seek to make deals and agree with each other. These agreements are really only possible because the parties involved have private property rights over the things they're trading, and because they both expect to benefit from such agreements. When the possibility of direct personal benefit is removed, the parties will resort to less obvious methods for self-aggrandizement. That is to say, they'll come up with other ways to skim off the top. Finally, in this chapter, Kropotkin makes a very Marx-like argument that the form of government fits to the form of the economic system of a time. Serfdom fits with absolute monarchy. Wage exploitation fits with parliamentarianism. Therefore, when private property and wage labor are abolished, there must be a new system of government. It's worth noting that Kropotkin does not make an argument as to why that new system would actually protect human liberty. He merely hopes it will. So, that is my coverage of Chapter 3 of Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread. So far, no really good arguments about anything. A lot of really bad economics, a lot of bad incentives swept under the rug, and a lot of hopeful new Soviet man nonsense that I think any rational person would just say, like, well, yeah, you assume that by doing this thing, the nature of humanity changes, and you've given me no argument for that being the case other than that you hope it will happen. We've got a lot of misinterpretation of history from Kropotkin here. We've got a lot of like, this is what I think will happen, therefore this is what must happen. We've got a lot of we see this price structure, and that means scarcity has been abolished. It's pretty bad. And I suspect it may be going to get worse. So yeah, we're 3 chapters in, and the chapter that I was looking forward to, Anarchist Communism, where Kropotkin was going to make his careful and detailed argument for why communism, or why the abolition of private property leads to anarchy rather than totalitarianism, has been a complete failure. I'm not surprised, but I am a little surprised that he managed to put this out with a straight face. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Chapter 4 next week. Try to think of something other fun maybe to do next week as well. And have a good weekend. It's Thursday, so, Friday and then weekend. And thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you like the channel and like what I'm doing, you know what to do. And I will see you next time for some more something. We'll see you.